Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this October 15th, 2014 for Stanford MedX, the live MOOC Google Hangout this evening that we'll be doing. So we're discussing this week the Engage and Empower Me course around participatory research. This week our participants had the chance to listen to both Brett Elder and Susanna Fox and learn from them and both of their experiences with participatory research. So we're going to be bringing in some comments from them, as well as listening to today's commentators. So we're lucky enough to have two e-patients joining us. For those that don't know, my name is Britt Johnson. I'm an e-patient advisor with Stanford MedX. I have had two forms of arthritis since I was a child. Spondylitis, which is arthritis of the spine, as well as rheumatoid arthritis, so for the last 22 years. So I've been an e-patient, I would say, for well over 10 years now. But we also have two wonderful ladies joining us, and I'll give them both the chance to introduce themselves. So I'll start off with Sarah Kucharski. Sarah, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi to everyone out there. I'm Sarah Kucharski, perhaps alternately or better known as Afternoon Napper. I am one of the e-patient advisors for Stanford Medicine X as well, and looking forward to talking tonight about some participatory research. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. So we also have Heather Gable joining us as well, so I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, I'm Heather Gable. I'm an e-patient delegate / almost scholar, I think, getting there. And I live with type 1 diabetes. I've been type 1 diabetic for almost 13 years. I was diagnosed when I was 11. I got involved in the online space about 2 years ago. I'm really excited to be talking about research with you guys today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, ladies. So we're going to dive right in. For everyone joining us on the tweet chat today, don't forget to tweet in your comments and questions to the hashtag MedX, and we'll be pulling some of those comments from you guys on there today, and any questions that you might have to join in on the discussion we would greatly appreciate. So this week, our course participants got to listen to e-patient Brett Elder and hear a little bit about his patient perspective, and as well as hear from Susanna Fox, who is currently part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and she's done a lot of work within participatory research, and she's really a visionary, I would say, in the field. So the course participants this week were asked 3 questions. So I'm going to outline those to kind of get everybody thinking about those first, and then we're going to continue chatting about those. So the first question was, where do you seek out health information? The third one was, what do you think is the best way to collect healthcare data? That was the second one. And the third one is, what do most healthcare statistics leave out or make hidden? So we're kind of going to be considering those through the entire discussion. So first, I want to throw some of these questions to our panelists today. A very simple one, but I'll be interested to hear your responses on that and how they might vary from some of the course participants' responses. So for the first question, where do you seek out health information? So Sarah, I'll go to you. And has that maybe changed through time as well in your kind of e-patient-hood?
So for me, a lot of the challenge in accessing information has been that dealing with a rare disease, there's not a wealth of information even available. So it's not as though there can even in some ways be bad information when there's such a dearth of it. And so I've had to really rely on medical journals, using PubMed, using the same kind of research that any medical provider would be seeking out. And the problem with that is something that we have talked about in other conversations of access to information, that too much of this is behind paywalls, and so there's a limitation to exactly what you can get. I've been fortunate that I've had enough positive relationships with medical providers so that they are willing to help me access that information for my own purposes. I do wonder about patients who are in my same sort of position who don't have that benefit and how they go about getting information.
No, it's a really interesting point, and I think we've got a kind of a good vary of disease representations here, and kind of how that will affect our ability or necessitate our, needing to find that research. So, Heather, I'm going to throw that first question to you as well. Where do you seek out health information, and has that changed through your 13-year process as well?
It definitely has changed since when I was diagnosed. I was essentially a child. I actually, okay, so right when I was diagnosed, I did go online a little bit. I was mostly a lurker, and I only used a website called Children with Diabetes, and that is a user-generated website, basically community support. And that's where I found any information that I was looking for at that time. Now that I'm older, I've gone through college, I sort of know how to look up research. I use like Google Scholar or PubMed. When I was at the university, I had access to other studies also, but I don't want to pay for them. So I only have access to that which is free and available online. I know that there's a whole lot of other information out there. But yeah, I rarely go to healthcare professionals with questions. I usually put it out to my community. Like Twitter is the most useful tool for finding things out, I've found.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, and I love that you say that you don't have access to that because there is a paywall. I like that you just put it that bluntly, because that's the truth. I think on principle, I won't pay for those, some of those publications as well, because they are behind a paywall. For me, my experience, again, like you're saying, you started with when you were a child. The same was true for me, searching for information, and I would really say it was my parents who started searching for information on my behalf. Yeah. And that was really through nonprofit websites at first, links towards various research and so forth, but still not gaining access to anything that was behind a paywall. And for me personally, I would say right now, when I'm seeking out information, I go directly to Twitter first, like you're saying. So that's the best, most instantaneous resource, 24/7 resource that we can use. And I see that constantly with patients. Just today, I was answering medication questions about, hey, I'm about to start this medication. I know you're on it. Can you give me any info about it? Just, that's what I woke up to this morning, and that's typically about every day as well. And so it's really, I feel like that's that peer-to-peer help there. And if you want to kind of flip the term, peer-to-peer review on its head, I would say that's what patients are doing, and taking some of that information and seeing how it actually applies to us. Because though a research article may come out, it kind of cracks me up, since I have arthritis, I've known intuitively for years that weather affects it, and yet all the research had said it indeed does not. And we could tell you otherwise for all this time, and then just suddenly, within the last year, oh, guess what? Research found that indeed it does cause pain. So, it's just kind of funny that, when some of the research comes out, it's not applicable to us because it's something we just inherently know too. So that's a whole other level. So that's really interesting.
One thing, actually, Britt.
Yeah.
Britt, I wanted to just mention, in relation to Twitter, one of the things that, I don't know, I almost want to caution, because I think that a lot of providers get a little bit gun-shy about this notion of patients getting information from other patients or seeking information out via social media. One of the strong suits of Twitter in particular is that patients or whomever can put out a call for information of, I need information about X. Does anyone know where I could get this kind of information and get it in a reliable manner, so that people aren't just Googling blindly, that it's making an educated and informed request for information and using the network as resources. And it's been so incredibly helpful to me. There's a line of, okay, what is medical advice and what is not? It's not even looking for the medical advice. It's looking for, where should I look to get this information, to do the research on my own, to learn about this, so that I can be an educated patient and take those questions that I do end up with to my provider for further discussion. So thinking about that, having providers thinking about what kind of resources that they can provide to increase access to information is vastly important.
No, I think you bring up a great point there. And again, to reiterate, I know we say this a lot, but the patient community is very good about kind of self-moderating itself. And if we do see bad information out there, the next thing you're going to see is a tweet or a comment on a blog or something out there that says, hey, here's a link to this website that shows that maybe that's not so correct, maybe could you, retract that or something along those lines. And patients are very good about kind of self-moderating that. And I think, I see within my own community when we do have a question where, no one's able to answer that, or gee, that's something we've never really considered before, and we have kind of put a call out there, we will ask the rheumatologists on Twitter. We had the prime example, and I know I've mentioned it on our previous episode of MedX Live, is a lot of us were swimming when the summer started again. And the question was, some people like to swim in lakes. And if you're immunosuppressed, should you be swimming in a lake? And that's something that is just never discussed in a clinical setting because that's just so far outside the realm of normal thinking of possible questions. And so we put it out there. We said, is it okay? And so the response we had is, don't swim in murky water. Don't swim near where you see ducks swimming, and maybe just don't swim in that open water, period, is the best choice. But it was a really interesting conversation that came up because that could have only really originated once patients get together and we started asking each other, fellow swimmers who were also immunosuppressed, who were also rheumatic patients, a very niche community, but we needed that answer nonetheless. So it is a very valuable resource in that, and we're able to kind of conduct our own research, if you will, that way. So I'm going to move on to the next question that we had. What do you think is the best way to collect healthcare data? So Heather, I'm actually going to go to you first since you're studying research a little bit. So what would be your response to that?
For the best way to connect with healthcare data?
Yes, sorry. Collect. Sorry, I wrote that wrong in the box there. To collect healthcare data. Sorry.
No, that's totally fine. I think the best way to collect it is to start by asking the right questions. And I think pertinent to this conversation is that you need patient perspective to understand and an insightful question when it comes to that disease. So I want to know, or I want to be asked questions about how my disease intersects with my daily life. So it's not so I have diabetes. It's not just about the A1C and how a number that represents something that happens over a 3-month period. It's there's so many more things than that, and we've talked about before how story intersects with that data, and I think that we need to be asking more insightful questions.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. As we were discussing, and this was mentioned by Susanna Fox in her talk as well, kind of brought up, and it's been brought up repeatedly throughout MedX, is that data is really nothing without story. And the patient perspective is really where you bring that story in. So, Sarah, I'm going to give you a chance to also answer that question before we discuss it a little further. What do you think is the best way to collect healthcare data?
For me, the question is even a matter of what kind of data can be collected and who is doing the collecting. Is it that the patients are the ones doing the collecting? In my disease with fibromuscular dysplasia, those of us who are impacted in the renal artery stenosis can lead to increased blood pressure as a result of renin being emitted. And so we are instructed to keep tabs on our blood pressure, which I've also heard that some nephrologists or vascular doctors just rue the day that patients had access to a home blood pressure monitor. But for us, it can be one of the early hallmarks of disease and something that's really relatively easy to pick up, and that you can take it 3 times a day in various positions and keep a log of it, and that's not any incredible burden for the patient to face. And however a patient needs to track that data, whether it's good old-fashioned pencil and paper, whether it's using an app, that part to me seems less important than having the belief doing so, that collecting that data is worthwhile, and that when they take it to their provider, it will be used and considered in their treatment plan. Other things that we can keep track of are, again, you have to go to the lab, you have to go to the doctor to get the blood draws, to get that kind of information. And so aggregating that, putting that into some kind of context and system that matters for the patient, so that the patient can keep tabs on whether or not changes in a healthcare plan are actually making a difference. Again, it almost doesn't matter how that's collected, so long as it works for the individual patient, and that then that data is actionable.
I think that's a great point. You know, if it doesn't work for the patient, if it doesn't work for the healthcare team, how it's going to be presented either. If neither can make sense of it, it's not going to be helpful to either. So it needs to be in a way that is, you know, easy for the patient, that the patient wants to participate in, so that they will participate in. And I think that leads really well into kind of the next point that I wanted to bring up. In Susanna's talk, she discussed doing some research around migraine. And they discovered that when there was some research that was being done, they were trying to figure out what patients wanted to know. And so what did they do? They asked one doctor. They asked one doctor what the patients wanted to know, and they came up with a certain list of questions, and they created this kiosk that was supposed to help patients. Well, they got it completely wrong, because the first question that patients with severe migraine wanted to know was, am I going to die from this pain? Which to a neurologist is not going to be the same question that they're going to ask up front, and may seem like a hypochondriac on their part, or the patient might seem like a hypochondriac for asking that question, or ill-educated, but the truth is, it's a very real fear. When you're feeling that intense pain, that's going to be the first thing, whether it is valid or not. And I am a chronic migraine sufferer, so I so empathize with that level of pain. And that question, you know, has run through my mind before when I've had these severe ones and ended up in the hospital for it. You know, is, am I going to die? Can this get that severe? And I found it really interesting that that was the number one question that the migraine patients wanted answered first, yet the neurologist hadn't even thought to ask it once. So I think that plays really well into the last question here that was asked of the course participants. So Heather, I'll come to you first on this one. So what do most healthcare statistics leave out or make hidden? What do you think from the patient perspective then?
I think a lot of the small details get left out. And also, there are questions that patients don't want to ask doctors. And maybe that goes back to your point. Like, I don't really want to ask a doctor if I'm going to die from something. I feel like it puts them in an awkward position, but I do want to know that question. So healthcare stats really leave out that portion of the story, the part that's more difficult to talk about. The taboo topics are rarely covered in health statistics, and also the extrapolated data, is that the right word? It's just like the pieces that don't fit in the nice bubble. Like, what about those? And like, what can the outliers tell us about the rest of the data? Like, who are they, and what can we learn from them?
Absolutely, and we have a great comment here from Courage Sings on Twitter. She says, I think it's important what we do with the data and not just collect mindlessly. So I think that kind of comes to your point, that if we're not looking at it correctly and we're not analyzing it correctly, we're maybe, you know, those outliers that you're talking about, maybe they are much more relevant than previously thought, and they shouldn't just be shoved out because they are an outlier. You know, those one or two you know, research pieces or data points in there could make all the difference for the rest of the data as well. So Sarah, I'll come to you. What do most healthcare statistics leave out or make hidden, do you believe?
Yeah.
Loaded question, I know.
Right. So statistics are not human beings. They boil everything down to clinical relevance, but have absolutely nothing to do with what it means to actually live with a disease. They can tell us information, but they don't tell us why. they don't give us that deeper meaning. And it's been, again, in my community, very interesting that statistically speaking, everything about the disease that's been published has focused on, well, which arteries are impacted, and do aneurysms happen, do dissections happen, how often are which arteries impacted, and is it either an aneurysm or a dissection in that artery? Like, that's great. That will inform the diagnostic, either interventional radiologist or nephrologist, whoever is dealing with it. That will inform their knowledge to make a diagnosis. That does not give them bupkis to go on in terms of actually treating me as a human being, as a patient on a day-to-day basis. And none of the statistics included the things that our patient community was actually complaining about. And I, on a day-to-day basis, am not going to complain about a dissected artery. I'm going to complain about fatigue and dizziness and headache and these things that actually impact my quality of life. And so as we look at numbers, just the need for narrative is so incredibly strong, because that's the only way that you get the context, that you get the humanity of disease, and that it becomes more about caring for people than just lab values.
Absolutely. And, you know, I would say I've been looking at kind of some pain language recently, since I deal a lot with chronic pain, and that brings up, it's very similar to kind of what you're saying, because since I was a child, I was asked, well, is it dull, is it aching, is it throbbing? And in my mind, you know, as a child and a teenager, I was thinking it's none of those things, but how can I best fit what I'm feeling into your little boxes, which I think is so, that's the issue, you know, is that maybe the not enough questions or not the right questions are being asked within research. Even when we're talking about, you know, research on the most basic level of filling out a patient questionnaire, patient form in an office, to the greater, you know, patient or participatory research as well. And, you know, Susanna, again, in her talk, mentioned that when patients, she said at the end of a questionnaire, when they asked, is there anything else that you would like to share? She said they had an overwhelming number of responses, and that was where they found the most insightful info. So where they thought they had figured out all the right questions to ask, they learned that they indeed did not, and that's where they gained kind of the most valuable knowledge. So, and that goes back to what Dr. Mark Katz has said as well. You know, he asks at the end of his appointments now, you know, is there anything that I forgot to ask? Is there anything else that you know I can help you with? You know, he ends it on that kind of questioning basis. You know, what else do you need from me? And I think that's a really important way to approach healthcare, is to have it that two-way conversation, and that, you know, boils down to research as well. So I'd like to ask, I'm not aware, have either of you participated in any sort of clinical research before?
I have participated in research having to deal with testing like glucose meters. I haven't done any drug testing.
So what was it like dealing with the glucose meter testing from your perspective, and did you feel like you were being asked appropriate questions throughout the process?
Yeah, sort of. The one thing I have to say in the beginning, I had to sign a like 6-page document that I would not share any of the information and any of my experiences with this, and I had already been blogging at that point, and I was really disappointed by that, because this is a potential innovative meter, and I can't share it with anybody and ask them how they would feel, because I am, to some respect, a representative for my community, but even I don't encapsulate all of what people with diabetes would have to say about this meter. And so being able to share would have been awesome. That's the first part. And the second part, they did not ask me about how I felt checking my blood with this meter. They didn't ask me about how do you feel about the fact that the meter was blue or something like that, which I do actually have reactions to. and not, like, they only asked me about pain with the prick, and then like how fast it was, and that was it. So like my feeling about it was missed completely.
So that's been my experience. I've participated just in one device trial for injectable medications with autoimmune. And that was the same thing. The psychological aspect was never even brought up. They were trying to ask me why I was doing certain things a certain way because I went about it in my normal way that I've been injecting myself now for close to 10 years. And it was freaking them out. And why are you doing this? Why are you going through these steps? This is the way I always do it, you know. And they never asked why or why not. And what I had to explain to them was that I have difficulty because of the arthritis in my hands doing it in the proper way. And so therefore I've had to adapt to another way, which freaked the researchers out. But their gut reaction was, you're doing this all wrong, we have to start over again, as opposed to looking at it as a moment to learn and to see why I was doing that. And when I tried to explain to them, I was literally told to stop talking because I was messing up the research process and I was maybe going to bias their further questions and change things, which I can understand, but there has to be a way to validate that and bring that in. And the really interesting part was, and what they chose to do was role play with me, essentially. And that's kind of what ended up in the record was. So we role played as if it was my healthcare professional that I was calling and saying, quote, I'm having difficulty with my hands while I'm trying to inject. Please, let's walk through this. And so it allowed them kind of to step back and ask questions in a different way that was still congruent with the research process. So it was really kind of eye-opening to me. And then we go through the entire process, and what they didn't ask me was, is this something you would use? Is this something you would feel comfortable using? And I was not even asked that. And at the end, I wasn't even given a spot to just voice my feelings about it. You know, none of that. Is there anything else that you would like to share? And so I had to, the guide says to me, well, we're done. And I said to him, I'm not done, you know. And I said, you know, I have a lot to say here. I said, this thing doesn't work. I would never use this. Here's why. And he kind of wrote it down, but I'm wondering how much of that actually ended up in it. So I think, you know, partnering with patients to ask some of those kind of the psychology of it, the emotional health of dealing with some of these things is very important, like you bring up, Heather. I guess the next thing I kind of want to ask as far as participatory research, and we were, you know, just to our audience out there, we were talking about this a little bit ahead of time. Heather, do you feel comfortable kind of bringing up your blog posts and since you're going into research? So how about you tell us a little bit about that, and then I would love to hear kind of Sarah's comments on that as well. So.
Okay, yeah. So I have been applying to grad school broadly in the category of health research and outcomes. And I have been a part of the process of applying to graduate school, of course, is to email current professors to see if your interests fit in with theirs so that you can sort of work under them in the development of your graduate career anyways. So I emailed one and I said, hey, I'm interested in diabetes. I'm a diabetes advocate. Here's all my resume information, and I'll read the sentence so that I don't. I got a response back from him. He said, great work, but it is not always advisable to study a topic with which you have a close personal involvement. Again, it is about scientific objectivity here and not advocacy or clinical work. So the blog post that I wrote was a response to that, and I have a very visceral reaction to that for a couple of reasons. One, because I feel extra informed. I feel like I'm like uniquely positioned to contribute to the field of research in the area that I'm so close to because I'm so close to it. That was my first visceral reaction. And then the second one is the second part of what he said, which is it's not about advocacy or clinical work, which I feel like if you're doing research that's not intended to translate into any kind of advocacy or clinical work which would benefit the patients, then what's the point of doing it? So while I understand, and I acknowledge this in the post, I understand where he's coming from, the idea that bias could be introduced into something that I study because I'm close to it, I feel that the positive side is so much stronger. That's, yeah, essentially.
Yeah, which I think is just such an interesting point. So Sarah, I'll let you follow up to that because you had some great comments about that earlier. So.
Well, my first level of dismay is that this person is teaching. Because if you take away the science of it, that basically the comment is, well, gosh, don't go into anything that actually interests you. Don't go into anything that you might have some sort of inner drive and feel compelled to work on. It's like, well, gosh, don't go into archaeology because you went to Egypt and had a great time. It's such an incredible level of emotional disconnect that I think does a disservice to the overall purpose of curiosity. We are curious about things we care about. We care about the things that we get curious in, and why would anybody want to stifle that? Now, again, I do see and concur that, yes, if you care about something, if you have a certain, say, stake in the game, that maybe bias can be introduced. And this is actually even a really big topic within the rare disease community, because researchers often are discouraged from ever getting to know any of the patients who are impacted by their work, because if you form an emotional connection with these patients, would you somehow skew or bias the data in their favor? And again, I get that, because hopefully, theoretically, people would like to help. But on the other hand, what's to keep you going? How else are we to stay enriched in any sort of topic if we do not derive some sort of emotional fulfillment from it? Everything in our lives can't be completely about firing the synapses in our brains to gain sheer scientific knowledge. There has to be, again, the humanity within the data. So otherwise, yeah, it just kind of it ticks me off that there is an assertion that somehow an individual also could somehow be so flawed as to not be able or be unwilling to interpret data for what it is, that we are insufficient somehow as human beings and not abiding enough by the scientific process as to divorce ourselves from it. And again, I think that just does a great disservice to any patient, anyone who has ever had a personal connection, whether it be themselves or a family member, in evaluating their potential contributions.
Well, and we have a perfect tail end. Another great comment from Courage Sings on here. She says, I wonder how many researchers don't disclose their personal connection because of professors and or professionals like the one that Heather described, which I think is an excellent point. You know, I know many advocates or many people that have sort of come out with their diseases much later. It doesn't matter what industry they're in because they're afraid of that judgment. You know, how they'll be viewed as, like you're saying, less than possibly or flawed. And what I would argue is that, you know, with Heather's bias is not a benefit to what she's going into. You know, we see bias as a bad term, but could it not be beneficial that she would know more quickly which questions to ask, more intuitively where to get to? Could she not essentially answer questions and get to research ends and maybe, I'll say the word cures, faster because she knows kind of where that line of thinking needs to go? You know, and I see a lot of people in my own community that are studying to be involved in the field of rheumatology in some way. I know a young woman who is a couple years older than me who's becoming a pediatric rheumatologist because she has JRA. she intuitively understands it. But like Sarah, like you're saying, she also has the intelligence to separate herself and say, when she's going to be a clinician, and be able to say, is this what this child is experiencing or not? But when that child is, she's going to be able to empathize and treat that child on a whole different level than, I would argue her clinicians were ever able to. So I think we need to not look at bias as a negative term, but look at how might bias improve participatory research. So I'm going to ask you ladies one last question this evening to kind of tie it back in and why we're here. What can patients contribute to research? So Sarah, I'll come to you, and then Heather next. So it's a big question. But why should we have patients in the research process? Why should we consider them as part of participatory research?
The first example that I do think of is tied to this whole idea of asking the questions that matter. There are questions that are just sheer science-based that we do need to know and understand, and then there are the questions that are much more quality of life-based. There's a great example of social media-driven patient-organized research that specifically it ties into spontaneous coronary artery dissection, which a group of patients got together online and collected enough data about themselves, found their overlaps, found ages, childbearing years, all these factors that they had in common, and collected enough data as to present that to, it's a Dr. Sharon Hayes at the Mayo Clinic, and say, study us. Study us. Here's what we've got. What else can you learn from us? And this has led to so much more knowledge in this field. And would that have ever happened without patients, without that drive, without that thirst for knowledge and wanting to know what it means individually to them and to their overall group of patients? So we provide the reason that isn't purely monetarily based, that isn't purely science-based. We provide the context in which it actually matters.
Oh, that's perfect. So Heather, I'll throw the same question to you. What can patients potentially contribute to research? Why should patients be involved in research?
I want to answer this by bringing it back to a point you made. You said that when your doctors, when you were younger, asked you what your pain was like, they were trying to put it into little boxes, and it never really fit into those little boxes. And I think that a part of that is because living with a chronic disease is really fluid. It doesn't exist in boxes. It isn't like one day happened and that was it, because tomorrow I'm still going to be feeling the effects of that high blood sugar from today. Mm. And that's a diabetes example that shows that. And I feel like I'm getting lost because my blood sugar is high. But how can we include patients?
Yeah, or why is it important to include patients in research besides just studying them? So, but I think you've made a perfect comment that chronic disease is fluid. Yeah.
And actually, you're illustrating it perfectly at the moment too.
Exactly.
That changes happen. We do not plan them, and we have to adjust them in real time. Mm-hmm. And that's not a lab value. That is not a perfectly controlled environment. Instead, it's life.
Yeah, exactly. So you're demonstrating life, which is couldn't be any better example right there. And that's something that nobody else would understand. What that feels like in that moment, how that appears, how that looks, everything. What you just felt there. And so on that note, we are going to go ahead and wrap up here, though. So I'll give you ladies a chance for any last comments on the idea of participatory research, and also if you could tell us where you can be found online so that people can follow up with you as well. So Sarah, I'll let you go first.
Just the last thoughts would be, don't divorce yourself from the reason that you got into research, and the you in that case being very specifically the researchers. And anyone who is interested in doing research, go ahead, reach out to patients, connect. God, there's so incredibly much that we want to share, that we have questions about, that we will give you freely because it matters to us to try and make that difference. And so that being said, if you want to ask me anything, please do feel free to reach out to me at Afternoon Napper. You can find me on Facebook the same way, and pretty much anywhere else. If you just look for Afternoon Napper, you end up with either me or moms trying to figure out how to put their kids down for naps. So either way, you'll probably win.
Great. So Heather, I'll give you a chance. Any last thoughts this evening, and how can people find you online?
Sure. So I think if I were to try to look through the eyes of a researcher, my resistance to including patients would be that they come in and learn about what you're doing and then sort of like muck up the situation. They tell you, no, your definitions aren't right, you're not looking at the right thing, and that can be really scary, but it's also the first sign that you're not on the right track, that you're sort of missing the mark. And for researchers who are sort of afraid of that, I like want you to think about what's worse, like completely missing the mark or sort of redoing a part of your research to integrate that perspective. I think the answer is really clear. I hope the answer is really clear. I am, interested in doing any kind of research work with anybody. If anyone wants to contact me about that, or just to talk about any kind of experience with grad school and that process too, that's fine. I'm really deep in that right now. So my Twitter handle is on there. It's at Heather Gable, and my blog website is unexpectedblues.com, and I'm online all the time.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Well, in solidarity, I will show you, I've got my ice pack here, so I'm dealing with pain the whole time too. So I completely understand the brain fog and trying to keep track there. So I want to thank both of our lovely panelists this evening, Sarah and Heather, for joining us and for giving your insights into participatory research and kind of your experiences around some of those ideas. So if anybody wants to follow up with me, you can usually find me on Twitter at HurtBlogger. My blog is thehurtblogger.com, and I'd be happy to follow up with any of you guys there as well. And as always, you can find us on the hashtag MedX on Twitter, and also through at StanfordMedX, the designated account there. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and to Sarah and Heather this evening. And we hope you have a lovely evening, and join us back here next Wednesday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for our next discussion around the Engage and Empower Me class. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.